Perfect. Hey, Ian, thanks for your time this morning. I know that we're here for a lot of the Make Pop Music community. We've got it linked in there. So a lot of them are already familiar with you and what you do in your work, but could you just take a small second just to introduce yourself before we start hopping into all the advice and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. And it's great to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
No, my pleasure. So I'm a mastering engineer. I've been a mastering engineer for over 20 years. And I also have a website called productionadvice.co.uk, where I share advice and hints and tips to help people get better results recording, mixing, and especially mastering their music. It's kind of funny because it's called production advice, but these days I talk mostly about mastering. I also have a podcast called The Mastering Show, which people can find at themastering.show.com.
Great podcast.
Thank you. I've developed a couple of plugins with meter plugs, Dynameter and Perception. We could maybe talk about those a little bit. And
Absolutely.
I founded an event called Dynamic Range Day, which is aimed to raise awareness of the issues behind the loudness war. And the latest thing that I've done with meter plugs is a new site called Loudness Penalty that lets you easily and quickly find out if your music's going to be turned down by YouTube or Spotify or wherever, how much that will be. And you can preview it to see whether you're happy with how it sounds when that happens. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Amazing. Yeah, I know a lot of people in the community are already familiar with your plugins. A couple of them had questions that we'll go over in a little while. And I know personally I've used loudness penalty a bunch, just ever since it came out, I think in beta forever ago. So yeah, I mean, thank you for making all of those tools so easily accessible for everybody. I know that there's kind of like this big mystique around mastering where a lot of people kind of lump it into mixing and they don't fully understand, especially when they're getting into it, kind of mixing and mastering is lumped together. So before we kind of hop into the group questions, I just had a personal question. Like, how would you best describe what you do opposed to what somebody does when they're mixing, or even if they're including their own mastering? What are the benefits? And then what's kind of like your job? Because I feel like a lot of people send stuff to you that's not ready to be mastered, which we'll talk about later, but any advice?
So you mean the difference between mastering and mixing, or just the difference between me doing it and maybe somebody doing it themselves?
Yeah, just kind of touch on a little bit of both. Kind of what are the benefits of sending it to an outsourced mastering engineer, and then also like what could a producer expect, with what they're sending you. Kind of what's the range of the, like how much can you actually increase that production value with a master? Because I feel like a lot of people don't really recognize it.
Sure. Okay. So I'm going to come to that in just a second. Before I do, can I just ask anybody who's watching, if you could, I mean, it's okay for people outside of Make Pop Music, I think, to watch it if Austin's happy with that. Maybe share the link on social media. Give the post in the Facebook group a like so that other people know it's happening. Because when we do a Facebook video, everybody gets notified, and it's easy for people to kind of join in, because hopefully we'll have time for a few extra questions at the end. And if you have any questions, you can drop them in the comments of the YouTube video. But yeah, okay. So mastering, I like to say that it's, I mean, there's a bunch of different explanations I often give. One is that it's just making the music sound the best that it can be. Another one is that it's creating a production master, which back in the day used to be for vinyl, or more recently CD, and these days, probably online and streaming services. But one good analogy is it's kind of like Photoshop for audio. If you take some pictures that you're really proud of, maybe on a phone, or you've got a digital camera or whatever, and then you want to share them, and you get the picture up and you're about to hit share, and you suddenly notice that, there's somebody kind of has face bombed your picture, or maybe you've got some mustard on your chin, or the beautiful landscape picture that you took has a power line in the background, maybe, or whatever. Probably what you would do then is pull it into Photoshop, or maybe you've got another photo editing suite, and there's stuff that you can do, right? You can use the clone tool or the magic wand thing to get rid of those annoying little details. And while you're there, you might also tweak the contrast and the brightness and the color balance. You might crop it, so you might choose to make it square or look widescreen or whatever. You do all kinds of stuff to get that picture looking the best it can possibly be. And mastering is kind of like that for audio. So contrast and brightness might be tweaking the EQ and balancing the dynamics, a bit more compression, or maybe your little bit of tasteful limiting or whatever. Tops and tails, so getting the start and the end precise and clean could be like cropping the image, or maybe cropping the image is like about how loud do you make it, you know, how much do you kind of expand the image to fit the frame there, or how do you frame it? So that's kind of one of my favorite things. In terms of the difference between me doing it and somebody else doing it, I mean, people think or some people think it's a bit weird that I have a website that tells people how to do what I do professionally.
Yeah, I get that a lot.
And, you know, I mean, obviously if you want the absolute best from your music, my belief is that you should go to a professional mastering engineer. But I also understand that not everybody wants to do that. So if people are going to work on their music themselves, then I would like to help them do the best job they can with it, rather than, because there's a ton of bad advice out there about mastering. Yeah. I think the main advantage of using a pro is that that's what they do, right? It's just experience. So it's completely possible to master your own music. I have there's over 1,000 people have taken my course now, and some of them have gone on to be professional mastering engineers, and a load more of them get great results themselves. But it's not easy, right? There's a big learning curve. There's a ton of details to go into and to understand. It's a whole different mindset than mixing. And if you're kind of intrigued by that and excited by it, then you're going to enjoy that process, all right? So that's probably a good thing. But if actually your focus is on the music and getting it out there and having it sound great, then trying to kind of rush through the mastering process, or just, you know, quickly do something, probably isn't going to work out that well. Mastering engineer will also have an objective perspective, right? So we listen to different stuff all day, every day for years. So as soon as your music as soon as we hit play, it's kind of like, okay, so that's maybe a bit too loud or not quite loud enough, and the overall amount of bass is maybe not going to translate well to the widest possible range of playback environments. You know, maybe it's not going to work that well on earbuds, or it would be okay on earbuds but not so much on a huge speaker system or whatever. But they'll have that experience and that insight. They'll be able to work on it fast, and they should have gear that is possible of getting the very best results. I'm not going to say the best possible gear in the world, because one of the kind of the unofficial tagline of the course on my site really is, it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it.
I saw a whole chapter on that in the layout.
Right. I mean, you can get fantastic results using, I'm not going to say cheap plugins, but I mean, you know, there's a ton of really affordable plugins in comparison to what the hardware used to cost back in the day.
Very accessible.
Exactly. It's accessible to, you know, pretty much anybody, and it's much more about what you do with it than what you actually do. I mean, the other thing that's tricky, that is harder to crack than just what gear to use or whatever, is the monitoring environment, is what you hear. So there's two big challenges if you want to master, especially your own music. Chances are you're still in the same space. So if your monitors are hiding something from you or tricking you in some way, then that's going to be just as true when you're mastering as it was when it was mixing. Whereas a mastering engineer will come to it with a much higher quality system and a completely different system. So that gives them a different perspective. And the other thing is that you worked on it yourself. So the risk is, you know, you kind of hear that maybe, oh, the kick drum is a bit boomy, and you kind of go, oh yeah, well, that was because of this, this, and this. So that's probably okay. Whereas a mastering engineer would go, well, that's a boomy kick, and I need to tighten that up somehow and get straight in there and deal with it. So those are the challenges. You can get around them. And, you know, there's all kinds of advice on my site to help people do that. But it's a challenge and it takes time. So it's something you have to, you know, be I think enthusiastic about wanting to do. I think if you're kind of going into it, go, oh, I've got to get these mastered, that's probably not going to work out, because it deserves the time, I don't know about the same amount of time and attention, but equal amounts of time and attention as every other process, you know, recording, mixing, the whole thing. Oh, I seem to have lost Austin. Hopefully that's not a big disaster. Let me move across and look at some of the questions so that we can keep this thing going. Hopefully he will come back in a second. I'm just going to find, okay, here we go. So we had several, I'm going to try and answer some of the questions from the that you guys left in the Facebook comments. And then if you've put any in the chat, then I will add those. So let's take a look. I'm slightly concerned that the whole broadcast may have stopped, but it's not telling me I'm disconnected. So I'm going to assume that it's fine and that Austin is going to come back in a second. So Alberto asked if I have a checklist of what to ask mixers to deliver when I'm going to be mastering their work, either to help with workflow or to deliver better sounding masters. And I don't actually have a written checklist, but I can give you an idea of some things that I would ask for. Really simple stuff first. Name the files clearly, so I know exactly what order they run in. You know, put a number at the beginning of each song. I've had a Facebook message. I'm going to check and see whether Austin is saying, "Hey, you've disappeared."
I am back.
He's back. Excellent.
Yeah, I am back. I heard you hopped right into the questions without me, so perfect segue.
Okay, that's cool. So yeah, perfect. I will carry on with the checklist. I was going to get back to the right tab. So clearly named files, numbers, you know, if there are different versions, if you have instrumentals, all that kind of stuff. So that we can see clearly what's going on. Also, a full track list, correct spellings. If you want everything capitals, make sure it's that. If you don't want any capitals, make sure it's that. Those kind of details. And remember to include the artist and the project title. So if it's an album, the title of the album or whatever. If you are having barcode details, if you're having artwork printed up for CDs and you've got a barcode detail, that can be added to the master if you want it. And also ISRC codes, International Standard Recording Codes. I think they help you get royalties if you get airplay. Those can be put onto the CD. So we would need those if you wanted to keep going. In terms of the actual files, they want to be stereo. I would say 24-bit probably, and use dither. If you're not sure what that is, head over to my site and search for dither and you'll find more information. In fact, I've just posted a video today that talks about dither. So there's more info there than you would ever possibly want on a really nerdy subject. Supply them at the original sample rate. If you recorded at 44.1, that's absolutely fine. There's no need to upsample to a higher sample rate. But if you recorded at a higher sample rate, then send that because chances are the mastering engineer will be able to code that down to 44.1 or whatever with the highest possible quality. Don't allow any clipping in the audio file. So clipping is when the peak level that shows in the DAW hits 0 and probably goes red. You don't need any particular amount of headroom. That was one of the other questions I saw. But as a rule of thumb, if you've got somewhere between 3 and 6 dBs headroom, especially with a 24-bit audio file, you're going to be in great shape. And that's good advice. People get annoyed at me when I make these kind of recommendations. I could talk about the reasons, but it's a bit of a tangent. It's just, it will help you it'll go back through the process. If you keep the levels generally sensible throughout the mix, then you'll avoid overcooking any analog emulating plugins or anything you might have. And also it'll be helpful for the mastering engineer, or at least avoid a problem. If you've got, lots of people will put the L1 or an ozone limiter on the final mix just to lift the level up when they send it out to play to people or to send to people. If you're doing that, you can switch that off because that loudness optimization is an important part of the mastering process. So and if you do stuff in the file that you supply, then it can't be undone at the mastering stage. If you've got a result that you're really happy with in terms of that kind of processing, then by all means send it over to the mastering engineer. Always be happy to take a listen to that and go, okay, so that's where you were, and yeah, that sounds great, and I'll do the same thing, or maybe it would be better if I did this, to improve things. And then the final thing is about loudness, which is just, for me, it's tricky if you have a mix that is already very loud. So it's not necessarily the end of the world, but everything that went into making that mix loud is then baked into the sound when you supply a stereo file for mastering. So let's just say that one song was mixed or mixed somewhere else, right? So you have 7 or 8 songs and then this other song is much louder. I'm going to want to turn that down probably to fit in better with the rest of the album. All of those decisions are baked in, which you could say is a good thing, but it also reduces the kind of the room that I have to maneuver in terms of what I'm doing. And I mean, especially if it comes from a really experienced engineer, those decisions could be completely appropriate and be great. But quite often, what I see more often is that something has actually been pushed a bit hard or taken a little bit too far, or has caused a problem that the person who was doing it wasn't aware of. So, and what you, in that case, I would request, hey, can I have a version that's a little bit less cooked? And I have 100% success rate of getting a result that they are happier with than what they supplied, but keeps what they were going for, right? Because that's one of the things about being a mastering engineer, is to listen to the music and go, okay, that's where they want to go. I'm going to help them get closer to that. So if they're going for an aggressive, saturated, dense sound, I'm absolutely going to help them get that. But quite often you can do it even better if you've got a less, if the version that's supplied is pushed less hard. How did I do?
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing, man. I came in right along like I think you were just finishing up clearly named files, but I mean, that would handle everything I've done. And I mean, that even goes the same for a lot of guys mixing. You know, it is always good to have a checklist so you can send clients. Because if you're getting clients that are self-recording or they're recording at different studios and you're working with different people, just having some kind of system so all of your files in your, in your computer are named the same. So even if I need to go back a year from now and I need to go look up a file, I need to know that the file that you sent me was named how I need to have it archived. So yeah, I mean, absolutely killer. It just kind of ties along perfectly what you were saying at the end as to the earlier question on why you would specifically hire a mastering engineer, just to get that extra little 10% that really takes a song over the top. But yeah, answered that question great. Love it. It's super similar to the checklist that I have for all of my stuff. So amazing. Let's talk about Christopher's question. So he was wondering what kind of tools you use in terms of metering your loudness, frequency charts, anything else. What would you recommend to mixing engineers to use at the end of their process prior to sending it to mastering? So what should be on a mix engineer's kind of two bus as their meter, I guess?
So I think the most important thing would probably be to say a loudness meter. Mm-hmm. Now, so there's a bunch of different meters, right? I already mentioned the peak meter that kind of is default in most digital audio workstations. That's going to help you avoid clipping, and it'll give you a rough idea of how loud something is. But you can have some sounds that have a very high peak level, don't actually sound that loud. If anybody ever tried recording hand claps, or pretty much any drum, any percussive instrument, you'll notice that it has a really high peak level. It doesn't always sound as big as you would like. So back in the day, we had VU meters, which were the needle meters. I still like using those, but we now have better. There's a thing called an RMS meter that people may have come across, but these days there is a specific loudness meter which measures things in loudness units, LU, and often they're called LUFS, which is loudness units relative to full scale, so 0 at the top and then they go down. Yeah. Getting hold of one of those and learning how to use them, I think, is really worthwhile. It's a little bit tricky because this thing was developed as a tool for broadcast, and it's unfortunate that I know why they made it complicated, but it is a bit complicated. So there are actually 3 different types of loudness that you can measure with a loudness meter. There's the momentary loudness meter, which reacts very, very fast. There's the short-term loudness meter, which is a bit slower than that, kind of, and I find the most useful when I'm mastering. And then there's the integrated loudness, which is an average figure for an entire audio file, or for as long as you've been playing audio through the meter. And when people kind of talk about, levels for online and kind of are saying, it was this loud, they will tend to talk about the integrated loudness. It's useful to have that overall figure, but it doesn't tell you. I mean, if you imagine just a kind of, let's do a silly example. You've got an acoustic guitar ballad that goes along, and then it has 10 seconds of death metal punched into the middle of it. Yeah. The integrated loudness value for that song will be pretty low because it's guitar and voice. But then it will get really loud at one point, and that overall integrated value doesn't tell you that. So I like to keep an idea on the short-term loudness as well. I mean, other than that, I think it can be helpful to have, say, an analyzer, so something that gives you an idea of the EQ balance of a track, but that kind of decision is best made by ear, honestly. Can be really useful for training our ears and figuring out how what we're hearing kind of corresponds to what's there in the mix. But I don't know that it's essential. There's a thing called a correlator, which gives you an idea of how much stereo spread there is in your mix. That can be a cool thing to use. But honestly, I think that the main one is the loudness, because anything else, I mean, that's one of so mastering, most of the time you're changing EQ, dynamics. So you've got a little bit of EQ, a little bit of compression, and maybe a bit of limiting. That's like 80-90% of the work done right there. I would even say that just a limiter and EQ and adjusting the levels, if you're not going for super loud stuff, can make a huge difference. And so you can, if there's an overall tonal imbalance in a mix when it comes in, which is not uncommon, you know, maybe the speakers don't have quite flat frequency response, or the room is coloring the sound, or somebody's personal taste, or they have a particular pair of headphones or whatever, we can correct for that. And that's a normal part of the mastering process. And you can play around with things like stereo width and stuff. I mean, everything else really is the domain of the mix. There are kind of interesting things that you can do to try and sort things out when, for whatever reason, you can't go back and get a mix revision. But yeah, mostly it's EQ and dynamics. So if the EQ can be corrected, the loudness is harder to correct. If somebody gets something super loud by pushing it right up into a limiter and it's really heavily limited, there's nothing the mastering engineer can do to undo that. So that's why, for me, the loudness meter is the key bit of that equation, I would say.
Yeah, I love it. And especially with the short term, I know you had the really, really drastic example, but even on like a smaller, more reasonable example for a lot of the viewers is like, I think pre-choruses come to mind, because everybody wants that chorus that explodes, especially in like dance music or pop music. And a big way to do that is, like, I tell people when they send me their demo mixes for me to mix, is I'm like, everything in this is too loud. Like, the chorus level is fine, but because the verses are loud and the pre-chorus is loud, you're not getting that punch. And I think it comes back to people doing the, you know, whole loudness meter of the entire song, just kind of looking back and being like, okay, the levels seem about right because I'm just blasting it 100%. And so I think that's really, really, really important.
Exactly. I mean, you're dead right. And the opposite is also true. So I just recently had somebody send me some files and say, well, we had these mastered by somebody else and they're not playing anywhere near as loud as we expected on Spotify. Can you help? Because I've got a bit of a name for sort of having, you know, I go on about this stuff all the time. And I said, well, maybe send them over. I took a listen, and what I found was the they'd kind of gone too much the other way, right? So the chorus was really loud, but the pre-chorus was, in comparison to that, fairly quiet, and the chorus was the verse was a lot quieter. So when Spotify measured the loudness of this song, because they turned loud stuff down so that you don't get blasted by loud songs, because that annoys people. So they measure the loudness of this song, and the method they used said, well, that loud section is really loud, so we're going to turn the whole thing down a lot. So they decided the overall value for the song was quite high. They turned the whole thing down, and that meant that the quieter sections, when you listen to it on Spotify, especially after something else that was pretty more full on, sounded really quiet. So when I did my master, I mean, I just did what I normally do. I didn't kind of aim it specifically for anything particular for streaming, because I don't think that, I just go for what sounds right with the music and then check it afterwards. But what I ended up doing was I reduced that contrast, not completely, because you still wanted that feeling of the chorus hitting you.
Exactly.
But I balanced it up so there was less contrast in there, and that meant I also reduced the overall loudness somewhat. So when Spotify measures my version, it decides the overall loudness is lower, so it turns it down less. So the intro sounds quieter in comparison. It's hard to describe in words, but I guess what I'm saying is you've hit on a really key part, another key issue in mastering in general, which is balance.
100%.
You know, it's not about matching stuff. It's not about hitting targets or the rest of it. It's all about finding the sweet spot in terms of the EQ, in terms of the dynamics, and in terms of the loudness.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so fickle with all of that kind of stuff, because one thing the other way is you're done. So yeah, I mean, are there any that you would suggest in particular, you know, because I know a lot of people are really picky with their gear, feeling like it colors things. Are there a lot of things that you think are the best representation to like what a human ear would perceive? That's also added to Christopher's question.
Well, yes, I mean, LUFS.
Okay, perfect.
That's the closest. It's not perfect at all, but it's pretty good. I mean, usually if I kind of compare what the meter says with what my ears tell me, they're within half a dB usually.
Okay.
And the good thing, the important thing about loudness units as opposed to all the other methods is that so there's this thing that happens in our head where when we hear a louder sound, we think it has more bass and treble. It doesn't actually change. It's just something that's a psychoacoustic thing. And so the LUFS system tries to take account of that. As I say, it's not perfect, but it's more reliable than if you, the problem with RMS, for example, is that if you have something with a ton of bass in it, so especially in urban or an EDM kind of genre, you will tend to see a much higher RMS value than you might think when you listen to it, right? Whereas an LUFS meter is going to give you something that's more, probably more measures up better to what we feel like when we hear the music, which is the goal. So yeah, that would definitely be my suggestion.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for knocking that question out of the park. I know Clay had one, and I'm assuming he's talking about in the mix phase or maybe even in the master phase, but he said, do you ever use dual mono plugins rather than a stereo plugin to maintain a wider master? He got the advice from Joel a while ago. And then he says that he always wants to keep cutting the upper mid range at 2 to 6K because he just comes more sensitive to it and he feels like he goes overboard. So I guess it's a two-parter. Would you recommend dual mono to keep something super, super wide? And then after that, how do you know when you're cutting too much?
I don't use dual mono, but some of the stuff that I use has the option to link the stereo channels or not. So if you disable the link function, then they're operating separately, and that would typically be compression and limiting, usually. You could do different EQ on the left and right channels, but that's usually going to sound weird. I mean, for example, if you had a guitar on the left and you wanted to EQ it separately, that might make sense. But then you think about it, if you've got something that's panned in the center, you're kind of EQing only one side of that thing that's in the center. So vocals and bass and drums and stuff that tends to be in the middle of the image is probably going to start to sound weird. The reason that it works is that if you, because, I mean, imagine you've got, say, a big tom roll on the kit, right, that goes around from the right to the left, say. If you have a linked compressor and the compressor cuts in and pulls back the gain because of that tom roll when it's on one side of the image, the overall level is going to drop. Whereas if they're unlinked, if you have separate left and right processing, then this channel can get held back and this one will stay there. So you maintain more overall loudness, but the stereo image starts to move. So I don't actually do that because for me, mastering is all about being transparent, is all about being invisible. And so if somebody chose to do that in the mix, that's one thing. But for me in mastering, that would be changing the mix in a way that I don't see how that would really be beneficial. If I want to get a wider mix, there's other stuff that I can do, stereo processing to get that effect. And my concern would be that something else might move as you have compression on one channel but not the other. So yeah, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but I personally don't do that. But in mixing and stuff, it could work. Let's say you've got a guitar bus, right, where you've got all your guitars bussed to a stereo and you've put a compressor across that bus to help bring the level of those up. If you've got two rhythm guitars on the left and the right, then you probably don't want this guitar reacting to changes to what this guitar is playing. You probably want those to be independent. So, and in that case, you probably don't have anything in the center. So it doesn't matter if they work independently. So I would say that's a kind of valid way to go that way.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same thing with doing like synth and sound design and stuff like that. Stuff that you might want to spread around and just, it's okay to get wonky with the image because that starts becoming part of the process. But in terms of like big mix stuff, you know, overall 2 buses and massive groups of instruments, I think you're right. I think especially if the next question is about getting carried away with EQ, I can only imagine how carried away you would get with that.
Okay, so the next question is about the mid-range, and that's a tricky one. I just did a whole episode of the podcast on mid-range, so people might like to check that out. And I kind of know well, I'm not doing that much mixing these days. I've done plenty of mixing over the years, but I'm really focusing on the mastering now. And but what I do, so it's not like I'm being tempted to put a ton of mid-range into my mixes or even into my masters, but what I do get is mixes where there is a ton of especially density in the mid-range. If it's just the mids are, or the bass and treble are a bit low, you know, the kind of the EQ is a bit like this, and I want to get it more flat, I can just use a gentle scoop in the EQ to even things out. But if people are pushing up those mid-range EQs, and especially that 2K area where our ears are really sensitive, into compression and limiting, you kind of get this combination of a build-up of EQ. There's probably tends to be a lot going on in the mix at that that region anyway, you know, because you've got probably guitars, vocals, keys, some drum stuff. There's all kinds of instruments that are active at that frequency. When you're mastering, the challenge can be that you start to take that out, and it's kind of stops working as well. It's like you can hear it, it sounds too bright. And for me, because I monitor fairly loud, it actually starts to make my ears hurt, which I think is kind of what Clay is saying. But when you start to correct for that, it can be tricky to get it to feel right. And actually that kind of leads on to, we had another question later on about whether I use things like Erksound Soothe, or Sound Theory's, I can't even read that, I haven't got my glasses on. Gullfoss, yes. So I have tried Soothe and I haven't tried Gullfoss, but the reason those can be helpful is that they're dynamic processes, right? So, or Soothe, at least, that I've used, is kind of listening out for build-ups in EQ, and it just pulls them back when there's a problem. So say you've got a guitar tone that's pushed really hard, but the vocal's okay. If I put a general EQ in to tame that guitar frequency, it's probably going to take too much away from the vocal in comparison. Whereas if you have something that only pulls back that frequency range when it's doing something, so the guitar is up front and catches your attention, the processing comes in and pulls it back a bit, and then it relaxes again and allows the vocal to come through in the gaps. That can be helpful. I mean, that's something I quite often use multiband compression when I'm mastering, and that's one of the nice things about multiband is it does that, but in a sort of more broad way. You can also, of course, use dynamic EQ.
Yeah, that's big now with the new Fab filter and the server EQ being so massive now. Yeah,
and TDM Nova EQ. There's actually a free version of that if anybody wants to play with a really good dynamic EQ. So again, the same thing. It's just an EQ cut when it's kind of like it has a threshold. So a little bit related to compression, right? But it's in a very specific frequency range.
Yes, sir.
Say again. Yeah, you're like a de-esser. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So those can be helpful, but I would say, so there, I have used Soothe once on a master, and when I did, I've tried to use it often. And the problem with these kind of, especially something like Soothe, where you don't have full control. With dynamic EQ, you can go, okay, 2K, I want to pull that back by maximum of 3 dBs. When Soothe is more kind of like you aim it at the general area, and the plugin does a lot of the thinking for you. Okay. That can be really cool when it works. But I said this off the top of my head on the podcast, and I think it applies. It's a Spider-Man plugin, right? Meaning, you know, I mean, everybody knows Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. And I think the risk with the more advanced your processing gets, the more risk there is that it's either accidentally going to do something you don't want, or because you're not hearing something, it's going to do something you didn't notice because you're focused on something else. You know, that thing where you're worrying about how loud the hi-hat is and you completely miss the fact that the bass channel is muted. Same thing happens in mastering, where you're kind of focused on that harshness in the guitars and you miss the fact that it's taking the life out of the drums or whatever. So I would like to, I'm a minimalist.
Okay.
I would like to try and achieve it with just pure EQ if I can. If that doesn't work, then maybe I might try dynamic EQ, or actually probably then I would try multiband compression, because that's nice and gentle the way that I use it. If that doesn't work, maybe I'll try and get in a bit more surgically with a dynamic EQ. And if that doesn't work, then maybe I'll break out something like Soothe. But I'd have to be really careful with it. And I know other people who use it more and swear by it. But it's a kind of special occasion.
So you'd rather be more in control. You like what it does, but you'd just rather be more in control with like multi-band EQ and multi-band compression and dynamic EQ.
Yeah, I think I want to, if I use it, I want to use it very lightly.
Gotcha.
Having said that, this one time that it was just, you know, really dense guitars, really aggressive upper mid range, all kinds of, you know, and I spent easily an hour trying to EQ one song to get a balance I was happy with, and I couldn't, and it turned out that Soothe was just the thing that it needed. So, you know, I think also there's a risk that you might learn to depend on a plugin like that, which
Exactly.
I don't know whether that's a bad thing, but I always recommend people not to use multiband compression on when they're mixing for the same reason. Because I kind of feel like if your entire process depends on one processor, and then one day, you know, let's say your iLok dies and you don't have access to that plugin, or it's a hardware unit and the power supply goes down or whatever, and you don't have it, have you then built up the skills to be able to get where you need to go without using it?
100%.
You know, so yeah, I'm quite like being a purist and a minimalist about these things, but you know, obviously people can take that with a pinch of salt. It's whatever
Perfect.
works.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Those plugins are super cool. They all have their place. Definitely know what's going on if you're going to use them, just so you can kind of understand how to pull back. Let's see. Richard had a question. He wanted to know what you like your mixes to peak at. I'm assuming post mastering. And then do you use any methods to gain that loudness without compressing the signal really, really harshly?
Right. So it's an interesting question about peak level, because back in the day I would have said just 0. But these days I recommend -1, but
okay.
It depends what kind of loudness you have underneath that. So let me explain why. Well, one thing is Spotify recently released some guidelines for peak levels, and that got this whole issue a lot of attention, because they're recommending -2 if the loudness of your mix, the overall loudness, is higher than -14 LUFS. So we don't have to get tied up on the actual numbers, but what they're saying is the louder you push it, the more careful you should be with the peak level.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because they are streaming data compressed audio information, right? It's not a one-to-one copy of what we have in our files, the WAV files that you submit. They encode it with a codec called OGG Vorbis. So it's kind of like MP3 or AAC that's in the iTunes store or wherever. Pretty much all the stuff you listen to when it's streaming has been encoded. The process of encoding, I mean, it's not really this, but roughly speaking, it kind of chops the whole thing up into lots of very narrow frequency bands. And it analyzes those and it says, well, which ones do I need most and which ones do I need least to recreate the original sound? And the stuff that it needs least, it throws away. It's a kind of a miracle that it works at all. But when you think about it, what you're doing is you're putting a ton of really narrow filters onto the audio, and then you recombine those at the decoder.
Okay.
And basically, it completely changes the peak level. You could, if you've got something that's peaking at 0 before you encode it, you could easily have something that's peaking at +3 when you decode it, and that's not so much of a problem, except that it will then get clipped by a lot of the software that plays it back. So the smart money is on having lower peak level going in, so that when the peak level gets changed by the encoding process, you've still got some headroom and you're not going to get clipped on the way back out. So like I say, you could get +3. So if you're mastering your stuff loud and you're at risk of getting +3 when it's encoded, then you probably should keep the peak level at -3. I don't do that because I don't go super loud with my masters, because give or take, the louder you make your master, the more it's going to get turned down on YouTube and Spotify and Tidal and Pandora and everywhere else. So I kind of feel like, well, there's no point in making it super loud on the way in because it's going to get turned down anyway. I might as well go for something that sounds more dynamic, which I prefer and which my clients tend to prefer, and have it not turned down as much.
Perfect.
That means because I'm not pushing the loudness really hard, I don't have to worry so much about the peak level, because the encode and decode, basically the more squashed dynamically the input to an encoder is, the more change you're going to see in the peak level, and the more risk there is of a problem. So -1. One important thing to say, that's -1 true peak. Some DAWs measure true peak. They also call it the intersample peak level. So it's basically an oversampled peak reading. So it warns you if you're going to have problems with peak levels going above 0. Some DAWs don't have that by default, but if you have a loudness meter, like I suggested earlier on, then that'll include a true peak measurement, and that makes you kind of doubly safe, if you like. If your true peak is at -1, you should be okay, unless you're going for a super, super loud mastering.
Perfect. And then we just had one question come in from the group. I think we'll probably take one more question, then we'll chat a little bit about your new course, your new masterclass. So let's go ahead and take this last question. It's from Mike. Mike, don't afraid. He's loving it so far. So I'm glad you're watching, Mike. Thank you so much. He's got a question regarding multiband stereo widening. So he says he likes to use it just a tad in the mastering process to give it a bigger stereo spread. But is it better before or after multiband compression and master bus compression?
I like to do that stuff before.
Okay.
Because if you imagine the perfect mix that only needs a little bit of EQ and a little bit of level lift, maybe, that's the ideal. So I would then put any mastering processing that I would do after that. If I get a mix come in that's not quite ideal in terms of the stereo width, then I would like to get that right before I make any of the mastering decisions.
Gotcha.
And I mean, so if you didn't do that, I guess the risk would be, let's say you had something where you wanted to get more going on at the edges of the image, so it's all a bit clustered in the center. If you put that through mastering compression and EQ first, you're going to have some compression happening. And because if you're me, it's going to be linked, going back to that previous question, it's also going to affect the left and right channels are affected equally, so it affects the whole stereo image. So if you imagine a pounding kick drum, right, causing a little bit of pumping perhaps, then when I apply the stereo processing to widen up that image and bring up what's on the edges, I'm also bringing up the pumping at the edges of the image, right? So I'm making the mastering processing more obvious. Whereas if I apply that stereo processing before the mastering process, and then the mastering compression controls that kick, any pumping that's there is going to be proportional to the overall stereo image. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
And I kind of feel the same way about EQ. I prefer to go into compression with a balanced EQ. There are some times when I would correct afterwards. But I mean, again, if you want to, well, if you have the compressor with the pounding kick drum, if you apply compression to that, and then after, so the compressor is holding back the kick drum and everything else, it's introducing a little bit of pumping, and then afterwards you think, okay, so I need more low end in that kick, and you add that low end in, that's going to do what you want, but all of that pumping is still there. Whereas if you do the EQ before the compressor, get the sound balanced first, and then it goes into the compressor, the changes that the compressor make are going to be balanced because of that EQ, and any pumping that introduces will be less noticeable. So that's my kind of preferred way of doing things. I tend to do everything beforehand, and there's no particular reason for this, but I would tend to I'd adjust the gain, then I would adjust the stereo image, then I would adjust the EQ, then I would adjust the dynamics. That's just me though.
Yeah, I'm the same in my mix process. It was so funny hearing you go over it, because I was just thinking, like, one day I was doing like a chain that I had always done on the and vocal, and as I was listening to it, I was like, this sounds so different than it always sounds. And I realized that I had dragged the widener on last in the chain, so it was widening that super compressed, super bright image, and I was like, ugh, disgusting. Dragged it second in my chain right after auto tune, and it was just like perfect. So perfect. Yeah, thanks, Mike, for asking that. I'm sure most people will say correction before you start doing all of your aggressive EQ and dynamics and stuff like that. So perfect. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for asking questions. There is something super excited that I kind of wanted to talk about. So as you all know, some of you might know, some of you might not know, but Ian has done courses in the past, and he has lots and lots of mastering content with his website and, the YouTube channel and everything like that. But I think he really, really wanted to take that to the next level. So he actually has now the home mastering masterclass. And I just want Ian to kind of talk about it and, say what's different from this than your, EQ course or your compression course or some of the content people might find on your YouTube channel. Is it all kind of supplemental to the ideas in this course? What's the big thing about this course? Because I know that this is the big one that people have been waiting on for you.
So it's the masterclass course is an 8-week course. So okay. Every week there's a new video where I master a new song or different song, and I use different software, I use different plugins, and I kind of tackle different topics. So the first one is fairly straightforward. It's just a bit of gentle EQ and a little bit of limiting. and then I get into all kinds of subjects like stereo processing and parallel compression and stem mastering, all those kind of the kind of the in-depth stuff. And I think what's different about it is it's kind of a bird's eye view. So the EQ and the compression courses are really laser focused on those topics, and very, very structured around those topics. This is more, you get to be a fly on the wall and watch the mastering process, kind of from a wider perspective, if you like, kind of pulls everything together. So you can pick up little bits about all of this kind of stuff from the podcast and the YouTube videos and the blog posts, but this kind of hopefully puts everything together. And also kind of, I mean, there are people who've done it who've never done any mastering before. They've said they found it helpful. I think it's most helpful for people who've had a try at mastering and, you know, maybe have some challenges they want to overcome.
Gotcha.
I've had professional mastering engineers take the course and say they enjoyed it. So that, which is nice, not really, you know, kind of who's intended for. I think the other thing is that people get to, so it's spaced out over 8 weeks to avoid people getting overwhelmed. But the other thing is that it means that they can email me with questions. And a few times during the course, I will actually have a live hangout like this, where members of the course can actually be in the hangout with me and chat and ask their questions and kind of follow up on things that I might have said in the video, some things they might not have had understood or that they want more clarity on. And I'm basically happy to talk about, you know, pretty much anything. It's called the Home Mastering Masterclass because I think that's the key. You know, most people who want to do their own mastering in a home studio are the people who maybe are going to benefit most from it. But actually, it's not like I'm dumbing anything down. You know, the stuff that I teach, these are tactics and strategies that I use myself daily and have done for 20 years. You know, it's the techniques are just as relevant now as they ever were. And I think the other nice thing about it is that, no, I can't remember what I was going to say. The other nice thing about it was,
I have a couple of nice things that I've just kind of noticed, like looking over the course notes, and then just being familiar with your, you know, free content is, to me, this sounds like if mastering was like a tree, right? This masterclass would kind of be like the trunk and the roots of the tree. And then all of the other content that you have is kind of like the leaves and the branches and the twigs. And so those are all great. But if you have no knowledge to like solidify all that down to, you're just going to have a pile of leaves and sticks. So I like that. And you reminded me what I was going to say. I was going to say that it's very much about, it is about what I do, but it's more about how I do it and why I do it. Yes.
What I do, you know, it's not like, oh, apply this EQ to fix this problem or whatever. It's all about the concepts that underpin it. And that's where I like your analogy, because it's the roots and the trunk, right? It's all about what I realized. I knew when I set up the website that people wanted to know about mastering, know more about it and how I did it. And when I first did it, especially with the EQ course, I was like, I don't know why I do this stuff. I just do it. It's just an instinct.
Exactly.
But when I thought about it more and I realized that actually, because I was lucky, I was trained as a mastering engineer. You know, I had mentors who helped me and assessed my work and gave me feedback in the early years. And I kind of have unpicked all the way back to that and realized that they taught me a kind of a group of core concepts that I basically have done so much that I've just internalized them, right? You almost forget that you know them. And it feels like an instinct, but actually, and what I've found is that by teaching people those same core concepts and explaining how I think about things and what I'm thinking about and, you know, what I'm looking out for, that is incredibly helpful for them. I get fantastic feedback from people who've done the course. And it, you know, it helped me, and it helps people who do the course as well. So, and I think that's what I like to think is different about it than, you know, there's a ton of kind of recipe videos out there, if you like, of, oh, put this, this, and this on your master chain and you'll be good. You know, mine is much more about, if you want to achieve this, then you might want to consider doing that. And here's why you might do it. And here's what's going to happen. And that kind of approach.
100%. That's the big thing that I love about this, is that it's so much more reactive. Because anybody can obviously take your chain and plug it on their master chain and be like, oh, it's an Ian Shepherd master. But what they don't have is they don't have those decision-making skills. They don't have those problem-solving capabilities. And that's really, really impossible to develop when you're just watching tutorials that give you everything that they do, but they don't break down, you know, here's why I'm doing this. If this was different in the mix that they sent me, I would have done this differently. This is what's actually going on inside. And that's what I love about this. And specifically about there being 8 weeks. So, a lot of courses really zone in on like one song. Like we have a lot of the mixing courses. It's like, watch me how to mix one song. And those are great, but you can't really develop that trunk and those roots without having different scenarios, right? So you have to know, if it's an electronic song, am I going to mix that the same as a folk, or am I going to master that the same as a folk song? And that's the cool thing about being the fly on the wall for 8 different sessions is it really, really develops the why a lot more, because they're saying like, oh, well, he didn't do that in that last one, or, oh, like this is a new thing that he hasn't done in the previous 4 weeks. And so people start understanding and they start correlating a lot of that. So I love that from the actual setup of the masterclass.
Oh, thank you. And I think you're right. The other nice thing about it is that it is interactive. The videos are pre-recorded, but there's a private Facebook group which has over 800 members now. There's a great community, really supportive, friendly bunch of people there, all of whom have done the course. So there's kind of conversations going on there that sometimes I get involved with, and sometimes I don't need to, because other people answer the questions just the way that I would have. And also the fact that you can email me with your questions. It's like, so you also get not all of the songs, but some of the songs you get the raw mix files to try and experiment with mastering yourself as well. So I get people kind of saying, oh, well, I tried to do this with the week 3 song, and this wasn't working. I tried what was that? So I can kind of look at it and say, well, maybe you need to try this or whatever. And if I don't manage to help them, they can come back again, right? So it's I think that level of feedback, it's kind of like YouTube comments, but on steroids and without the trolls.
Yeah, well, I think that's what makes it a class and not a course necessarily. Is like with a class, you've got the opportunity to raise your hand and ask a teacher, but with a course, it's just all delivered to you. So, you can always ask a comment. It may be answered, it may not, but you're not going to get that live feedback. You're not going to get the how and the why at the root of the actual problem. So I love it. I'm a big fan of any kind of like educational resource having some kind of classroom setting. And I love that yours is the group with, the live streams and the Q&As and the feedback on the masters and all of that stuff. So it's really, really important to have all of that. And I'm super glad you do, because it adds a lot of value to the course, man. Anybody can go watch a YouTube video that somebody's like put L2 on it, drag it down to -6 dB and you're good to go. But they're not really going to get anywhere with that. So
yeah, I think that's true. One other thing to mention before we go is that as a way of saying thanks to Austin for letting me be here and talk to you guys, I've set up a discount coupon for anybody who's interested in taking the masterclass. So the course starts on Friday. Where are we now? Tuesday, is it? So you've got a few days to kind of think about it. But yeah, there's a link underneath this video, underneath the YouTube video, and I'm sure Austin will share that in the Facebook group as well. If you follow that link, when you get to the checkout stage, you can put in the coupon code, which I think is MakePopFam. Is that right?
Yep, MakePopFam, FAM at the end.
Excellent. And that will get you it gets you a 32% discount if you go for the course on its own, or there's the enhanced bundle that includes the EQ and compression products as well. And that actually, if you add up the total value of all of those things without the discount, that comes to a 45% discount. So that's pretty good value, though I say so myself. So yeah, if anybody watching this kind of is interested in the things that we've been talking about, or takes a look at my site or the channel or the podcast and likes that and wants to dive deeper, then it'd be great to see them on the course.
100%, man. I appreciate it. Again, for the value, just picture this is a class. This is an 8-week program. It's cheaper than you'd go pay at a university to take a class on mastering, and it's just as helpful. And you can do it from the comfort of your own home. So that's huge, especially with all these bonuses that you were so gracious to give to the group and to our audience. And no, we've loved having you. I definitely recommend everybody go check it out. Also go check out all the meter plugs and stuff like that. I know we talked about those a little bit earlier, but meter plugs has some amazing stuff. And yeah, go pick it all up. Support Ian. We're super, super glad he hopped on and answered all of our questions. And Ian, thanks for having us. Thanks for being here. And I'd love to do this again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great week. Good luck with the release on Friday. And, let any of us know if you need anything.
Thanks, Austin. Will do. Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Have a good one.